Staying with Ukraine now, the head of NATO's military committee, Admiral Rob Bauer, says that Ukraine has the legal and military right to strike military targets deep inside Russia to gain combat advantage. However, there is still no consent from the US and other countries for Ukraine to use long-range weapons provided by them for this purpose. Meanwhile, President Zelenskyy is presenting a victory plan to President Biden as the US prepares a new aid package. The two are set to meet in Washington later this month. And the situation in Kursk is worsening as Vladimir Putin's army has launched a counteroffensive. There's clearly a lot to pick through about the situation in Ukraine, and we'll be talking about some of these issues with my guest, Adam Jasser, news director at TVP World. Adam, hello, and thanks for taking the time tonight.
Good evening.
Good evening. So the US is dragging its feet about allowing Ukraine to strike military targets inside Russia. What, if anything, do you think might change its stance?
Well, it seems the United States and other allies in the NATO alliance take these measures with some delay. So first, there is a lot of pressure, discussion in the public, in the media. And President Zelenskyy mentions this several times. And then after some time, after some pressure, the allies move ahead and provide what Ukraine needs. It's still very hard to understand why this delay always happens.
Yes, the thing is, John Kirby, White House National Security Advisor, has given a justification for this delay by saying that Vladimir Putin warned he would consider the West directly involved in the conflict if Ukraine was allowed to use these weapons. But then he goes on to say that this is not an unusual type of threat for Putin. So it's counterintuitive, isn't it? They're saying we're being held back by this threat, even though we know that it's a standard threat from Putin. What do you make of that?
I think a lot of it has to do with domestic U.S. politics. If there was a wide consensus in Washington, bipartisan consensus in Washington about supplying Ukraine with whatever they need, I think it would be much easier for the Biden administration to move ahead. But they are constantly under pressure from the Republicans who, and particularly Donald Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, who are saying, they will be able to finish this war in one day, quote unquote, and, through a diplomatic solution rather than strength of arms. So, for Biden, the space for maneuver there is small. Particularly that, for obvious reasons, both for him and for the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris, winning the election is absolute priority.
Understood. Although the stance has been the same since before, the elections raised the election raised its head. Now, Keir Starmer has indicated that he may allow British Storm Shadow missiles to be used for long-range targeting of Russian military sites. What do you think has brought this kind of change in his position on this?
Well, I think the British, to their credit, have been much more decisive in all of this. But they're unlikely to act without consensus with Washington. To make matters worse, Germany is also vacillating. And, Chancellor Scholz admitted in a recent interview, the German leader admitted in a recent interview that some German citizens do not support Ukraine as much as he does. This, of course, followed the rout of his party in local elections. So the U.S. is not alone in delaying this. But again, I think, like in the U.S., it's also in Germany. It's domestic considerations. So the British are pushing. And I think eventually, of course, Washington is going to relent. But I think really the focus now is switching to the next few months before the U.S. election. We just heard again vice presidential candidate Vance outlining what he called the Trump peace plan, and it is obvious that it involves effectively freezing the conflict at the current line, the current front, and it also hints at demilitarizing Ukraine and preventing it from joining NATO. So, effectively, that would mean Ukraine's surrender of 20, maybe 30% of its territory to Russia. So, for Zelenskyy, this is to me a bigger risk than even this delay with the weapons.
Understood. Now, you mentioned peace plan. President Zelenskyy has one of his own. Now, he's being very tight-lipped about what it contains. What's your impression of what might be acceptable in such a peace plan to the Ukrainian people and the president himself?
Well, Zelenskyy is insisting that the peace plan must be based on Ukraine's earlier 10-point plan. So, first of all, with the withdrawal of Russian forces, compensation, return of children and other persons captured, Ukrainians captured by the Russians, a number of points. And the difference this time seems to be that he's prepared to accept Russians taking part in this, if only to demonstrate that the Russians are not serious about peace. Because if an invitation to the Russians is extended, this is about to the Chinese, to the Indians, who are increasingly involved in diplomacy around this. So it puts pressure on Putin to come to these talks in good faith. And of course, Zelenskyy and many others in the West very strongly doubt, and probably rightly so, that Putin has that kind of good faith. So for Putin, the best outcome is actually the plan put forward by Trump and J.D. Vance, freezing the conflict and preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. So Zelenskyy obviously has the opposite agenda. He wants the Russians out, and he wants the freedom of his country to determine its future, including joining NATO. So I think there's a lot of maneuvering at the moment. The Chinese are out there. I will remind our viewers that Finnish President Alexander Stubb, who was on TV World a few days ago, mentioned that rather than Donald Trump, it's the Chinese President Xi who can make this one phone call to Vladimir Putin and force him into a serious conversation about peace.
Indeed, lots of manoeuvring going on, as you say, and we shall, of course, be watching it very closely here at TVP World. Thank you very much, Adam, for taking the time to share your analysis. Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night.
And that's all from us here on TVP World. Good night.